They used to call it a dead lake. For years, no fish swam in its waters, no birds nested on its shores, and the air above it carried the dull, metallic smell of decay. Locals would warn their children never to go near it, not because of ghosts or old legends, but because even the wind that touched its surface felt poisonous. This was once a thriving body of water, alive with reeds, frogs, and the songs of fishermen. But decades of industrial waste, chemical runoff, and sheer neglect had turned it into a lifeless scar on the map. And then, something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, quietly, a transformation took root, a story of redemption not just for a lake, but for an entire landscape. The lake lay in the heart of a once industrial province in northern China, an area that became a hub for factories and mining during the rapid economic boom of the late 20th century. These factories brought jobs and wealth, but they also brought something else: waste. Every year, thousands of tons of untreated industrial water were dumped into nearby rivers. The streams that once fed the lake began carrying a toxic cocktail of heavy metals and fertilizers. Over time, the lake's water turned black. Locals noticed that migratory birds stopped returning. Fish surfaced belly up, floating like pale leaves across the oily water. Scientists recorded oxygen levels so low that even bacteria struggled to survive. By the 1990s, the place had become a symbol of the dark side of China's industrial miracle. Environmental journalists dubbed it the Lake of Death, and for good reason. People living nearby developed respiratory illnesses. Farmland turned barren as the groundwater became contaminated. Yet despite the growing awareness, nothing changed. Cleaning up such a catastrophe seemed impossible. It would take decades, billions of yuan, and a level of political will that few believed existed. But in the 2000s, something shifted. As China's leadership began to prioritize environmental restoration, projects once considered utopian started to find funding. Scientists from the Chinese Academy of Environmental Sciences proposed a bold plan to bring the lake back to life. They began by mapping every single inflow, every pollutant source, every underground channel. What they discovered was staggering: the lake wasn't dying naturally. It was being poisoned daily by dozens of invisible veins of contamination. The first step was to stop the bleeding. Industrial discharge pipes were sealed, illegal waste channels were demolished, and factories were required to install filtration systems or face closure. It wasn't easy. Local industries resisted, fearing economic collapse. But the government offered something unexpected: subsidies for cleaner technology, tax breaks for compliance, and even relocation assistance for factories moving to designated industrial zones with modern treatment facilities. It was the first sign that this cleanup wasn't just another symbolic gesture, it was a national priority. Once the flow of new pollution was stopped, scientists turned to the water itself. Teams of hydrologists and biologists began experimenting with natural purification methods. Instead of relying solely on chemicals, they looked to nature for solutions. Massive reed beds were planted along the shoreline. They called them green filters. These plants absorbed excess nutrients and heavy metals, releasing oxygen back into the water. They also introduced floating wetlands, rafts of vegetation that provided habitats for microorganisms capable of breaking down toxins. Year after year, the color of the lake began to shift, from black to brown, from brown to murky green, and finally, patches of blue began to appear. It was as if the lake itself was breathing again. Fishermen who had long abandoned the area began to return, cautiously casting their nets in the shallows. They didn't expect much, but when the first small fish appeared, it made national news. Local media called it the miracle catch. The revival didn't stop at the waterline. Around the same time, a massive reforestation project began in the hills surrounding the lake. The goal was to prevent soil erosion, one of the main sources of sediment that had been clogging the lake's natural filtration systems. Thousands of volunteers planted willows, poplars, and desert shrubs. Birds began to return, first in small numbers, then in flocks. By 2015, ornithologists had recorded over 50 species nesting in the area, including several that hadn't been seen there in decades. It wasn't just nature that was reborn. The community itself began to change. What was once a place of despair became a destination. Ecotourism projects sprang up, with wooden walkways, observation towers, and small guest houses built by local families. The local government launched educational programs, teaching school children about ecology and the importance of water conservation. For the first time in living memory, people weren't avoiding the lake, they were proud of it. The economic turnaround was equally striking. Where pollution once drove people away, restoration began drawing them back. A new economy took root, one based on sustainability. Fishermen adapted to new regulations that allowed only certain fish species to be harvested, ensuring balance. Farmers nearby switched to organic crops, marketed under the brand Lake Reborn Produce. Even real estate prices, once near zero, began to rise as people wanted to live near the clean, scenic waters. Behind the scenes, the project also became a symbol of technological innovation. Chinese engineers developed advanced monitoring systems using drones and satellite imagery. These systems tracked changes in water clarity, temperature, and vegetation health in real time. Every fluctuation was recorded, analyzed, and used to fine-tune the restoration process. Artificial intelligence models helped predict algae blooms and water quality issues before they became serious. It was a perfect union of ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science. The global community took notice. Environmentalists from other countries came to study the project as a potential model for restoring polluted lakes elsewhere, from India's Yamuna River to Africa's Lake Chad. International NGOs began referring to it as the Chinese model of ecological resurrection. It wasn't perfect, no large-scale restoration ever is, but it proved something vital. That damage once thought irreversible could, with enough will and patience, be undone. There were setbacks, of course. In some years, drought reduced inflow, causing algae blooms to return. In others, nearby construction threatened to reintroduce pollutants. But the lessons learned from each crisis made the project stronger. Regulations became stricter, and community involvement deepened. People began to understand that protecting the lake wasn't just a government duty, it was a collective responsibility. By the 2020s, the transformation was undeniable. Satellite images that once showed a black stain now displayed a vivid turquoise jewels surrounded by lush green. Migratory birds filled the skies in spring, fishermen rode out at dawn, and families picnicked along the newly built promenades. The lake had become a living classroom, a testament to resilience, science, and human cooperation. And then came the ultimate proof. Nature itself responded in the most beautiful way. Species that scientists had given up on began to reappear. Lotus flowers bloomed for the first time in over 40 years, carpeting the water's surface in pink and white. It's like watching a miracle, one local elder told a visiting journalist. But it's not a miracle, it's hard work, finally paying off. Environmental restoration isn't glamorous. It doesn't make headlines every day. But stories like this remind us that healing our planet is possible. It takes time, persistence, and a belief that no damage is truly permanent. The rebirth of this lake, once toxic, now thriving, stands as living evidence that hope and science, when combined, can rewrite even the darkest chapters of our environmental history. In the end, the lake is no longer just a body of water. It's a symbol of redemption, of renewal, and of the power of human intention. For the people who live nearby, it's more than scenery. It's their identity. For the scientists who work there, it's proof that their methods work. And for the world, it's a story worth telling, because if a poisoned lake can come back to life, maybe so can our planet. When the sun sets over its now clear waters, the surface glows with gold and blue. The air smells of reeds, not rust. A fisherman casts his net and smiles, remembering a time when such a thing would have been unthinkable. The lake gives back what was once taken from it: life, beauty, and a powerful lesson that even after the deepest darkness, renewal is always possible. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as inspiring as I did, consider subscribing for more stories of hope and innovation from around the world. See you next time.